Tonight's talk is the first in our Pan-African speaker series, and you may have all gathered by now that we just love acronyms at the AFI. We've got PASS, which is the Pan-African Speaker Series, BASS, which is the Black Atlantic Speaker Series, FOUD, the upcoming Public Health, Architecture and Urbanism Dialogues. And since we're an institution that's located in 4 different places, Accra, Johannesburg, New York, and London, you could say it's because it makes for shorter emails and text messages, but in reality, it is more to do with our ever-expanding ideas about architecture. As everyone here probably knows, the term architect is protected in law. You can't call yourself an architect without a license, in the same way you can't call yourself a doctor until you've passed all the regulatory tests. We assume that the word architect or architecture is universally understood, that we all more or less know what architects do, and that the knowledge or training required to become an architect is more or less the same everywhere. In reality, of course, it's not true, and I'm not talking here about standards, I'm talking about context. There are 76 accredited schools of architecture in Africa. 56 of those are located in North and South Africa. So that is 20 schools of architecture for a population of nearly 800 million people. By way of comparison, although sometimes comparisons are pointless, there are 800 schools of architecture in the United States with a population of 350 million. So in Africa, that is 1 school for every 40 million inhabitants. The US has 1 school for every 436,000 inhabitants, and the UK 1 for every 800,000. Ghana has approximately 700 registered architects with a population of 30 million. The UK has 60,000 architects for a population of 57 million. So the idea that there is a universal context is a fallacy. But what is remarkable about tonight's speaker, and it's the reason I mention these statistics, is that rather than lament or complain about the situation, Issa Diabaté, together with his partner Guillaume Koffi, have done the exact opposite. In 2014, when we began putting together the first edition of Folio, the Journal of Contemporary African Architecture that is now published by the AFI, Issa submitted an essay entitled Billboard, the Model Citizen Ad Campaign. It was a short essay, just under 300 words, with 2 very striking images. In it, he argued passionately and inventively for a new kind of built environment professional who refuses to blame weak infrastructure, poor governance, corruption, and the lack of resources for our increasingly uncivic behavior, and instead embraces the challenges of taking on a wider role. He calls it mission creep, which is a term borrowed from the US military to describe the way a project starts off being one thing and then expands or creeps to become something else. Normally, architects are trained to resist mission creep. In its earliest definition, a profession is an occupation that is founded upon specialized educational training, the purpose of which is to supply disinterested, objective counsel and services to others for a direct and definite compensation, wholly apart from expectation of other business gain. In other words, a profession is not a trade nor an industry, and it is compensated according to a very clear, very transparent framework. It is therefore in the professional's best interest not to expand his or her role, but to limit it. But in Issa's essay, he immediately began dismantling that logic, and I'm going to quote him here. One of the main roles of any architect is to provide new solutions to issues experienced in his or her local environment. The role of the African architect should be expanded to include the role of the citizen, and in particular the responsible citizen, no longer a bystander or spectator, but a participant who accepts wider responsibility for the built and urban landscape. His firm, Koffi Diabaté, are the largest firm in Côte d'Ivoire by quite a margin. He was trained at Yale University and worked at firms in Côte d'Ivoire, the US and France before returning home to Abidjan in 1994. He joined Guillaume Koffi as an intern and became a project manager the following year. In 2001, he became a partner and Koffi Diabaté Architectes was born. He has presented work internationally as well as locally in West Africa. He was awarded a Knight of the Order of Cultural Merit in Côte d'Ivoire and has been involved in collaborations with partners as diverse as IKEA and Dak'Art. Their office is its own ecosystem, consistently pushing the boundaries of what architects can and should do, the arenas in which they involve themselves, and the arenas that they create. He is often described as quiet, but Koffi and Diabaté are the epitome of the phrase, speak softly and carry a big stick. It is an absolute honor and a delight to welcome them to the AFI as the first speaker in our Pan-African Speakers series. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Issa Diabaté to Accra.
I'm really happy to be here. Although Abidjan is not so far from Accra, it's a big change to be here, and I'm really, really happy to be in front of you tonight. And tonight I will share with you what has been our experience as architects, you know, from when I moved back to Abidjan to now, 26 years later, how this profession, in my eyes, has totally evolved from making buildings to tackling issues that are way bigger than building. So I will start the presentation now, which I call African practice. I think it should resonate to the environment in which we live. So to start the presentation, I think it's important to have in mind what the context is. And of course, context in our local environment means many things. It's physical, but it's also environmental, it's also social, it's also psychological and physical. So I will start by talking about physical context, which is, as you know, this is pretty much where we live, Ivory Coast, Ghana, in this region, which is tropical Africa. And of course, in tropical Africa, we have to rely on certain techniques in order to create good architecture. The first one being cross-ventilation. Second one being the fact that using ventilated roof can allow us to achieve nice temperatures inside. Another one is how do we protect ourselves from the heavy rains that we get from the sun. Another one is how do we block the sun to get in? How do we avoid creating overheating from sun on glass? Another is also how to use vegetation and greenery to sort of protect ourselves and achieve interesting temperatures inside. And another one is how do we use the sun and body of water with evaporation to achieve relatively comfortable temperatures inside. And to demonstrate what I just talked about, I'm going to just take you through a house that we recently designed. Very simple and usual principle in our architecture. We use one slope roof to take the water down. We tend to cross-ventilate the roofs so we can achieve a certain comfortable temperature inside. But we also protect ourselves from the sun with big overhangs and use pools to cool down the space, and use also remdurf in many cases to insulate in the internal spaces. And of course, cross-ventilation is something that we tend to use extensively because it's very easy to achieve and creates really comfortable temperature inside spaces. So this is the house I'm actually talking about. And you can actually see how there's all these systems, and I think it's much more about systems than about materials. How do they work? And those are systems that have just been borrowed from our traditional architecture. And of course, on the south, of course, region like Abidjan and Accra, you probably have noticed that the traditional architecture is made of what we call bamboo raffia, which is those sticks that are not sealed to the wind. So we achieve all the time cross-ventilation, and we avoid accumulating humidity inside the spaces, which is not the case with modern buildings, you know, that are sealed. And of course, 2 or 3 days of a closed room, you come back and you can smell the humidity. So those systems have been sort of for us a guideline in order for us to design contemporary architecture. Remdurf, as you see here, local wood, and a lot of materials that were sort of salvaged from other building sites. As you can see, the floors, this sort of terrazzo with pieces of stone that we just got from other building sites. All of that to sort of create or at least push a certain typology for certain buildings in certain area. And we've done a lot of building in this region, coastal Ivory Coast, in this place called Assini, Mafia, because it was relatively easy to do and relatively easy to experiment and try new typologies that sort of move away from the usual typology. You know, the avoidance of hallways and having all the spaces open and having the connection between the rooms, you know, happening by the terrace. And using a lot of local materials and local fabric in order to pretty much create an architecture that is, in our eyes at least, quite contemporary. Here you can see an image of the house from the lagoon. And of course, these systems that we've tested on a much smaller scale, we tend to apply them on bigger scale projects when they do apply. For instance, here it's a spirituality center that we designed in Yamoussoukro, which is capital of Ivory Coast. And what's particular about this project is we had to build on the site of the basilica. We were approached by the Ivoirean clergy to design the space, which is supposed to be a spiritual center, which is supposed to house people who want to retreat and be removed from urban space. But the big challenge is that we had to deal with this humongous building, which is very much actually in size close to St. Peter's of Rome and in design as well. And for us, it was out of the question to compete with the scale of this building, of course. It would have been useless. And we pretty much took another route, and we found this forest on the site, and we decided that maybe it was important for us to sort of disappear within the forest. And here you can see the scale of the basilica here, and this is our intervention, you know, for the spirituality center, where you can see all the three scales and trees that are supposed to swallow us later on. So when they approached us, they did not give us a specific site to intervene on, and we decided that maybe the best place to pretty much house the center would be in the forest in the back. Of course, we could not compete with the intimidating sort of layout, you know, the French Garden and the huge basilica. So we decided to go the other route and pretty much occupy this space here, which is within the only forest that we can find on site. Here it is. And here is the view of the basilica from the site, and this is the kind of vegetation we find on site. And here you can see pretty much the similar process as with the other building, you know, the body of water, the sun, the big overhangs, the Remdurf walls and the cross ventilation, roof ventilation, all of that to sort of pretty much blend into the architecture of the environment. Here you can see a plan of the entire center. Here is the road that comes from the basilica, and we are sort of disappearing within the existing body of trees with main space here connecting all the different other spaces which are made of rooms to be occupied by people who come and retreat. Here, number 6 is a chapel, and the others is just like support activities like administration and restaurant and what have you. The composition of the layout is through this main space. As you enter here, this is the main space that distributes all the other spaces, the room mainly, the amphitheater, the administration, and the chapel here. It was important for us to create a body of water here, not only for climate effects, but also because in this axis we have the sort of little forest connecting to another body of water. So it was pretty nice to have this water as we walk in. This is a general view of the building environment. And of course, as you can see, all the roofs are very simple and very simple wooden structure elevated to create ventilation. Here's another image in a general view from the back, from the body of water onto the center. Here is the amphitheater, where you can see that the roof is raised to allow light to come in and also to create cross ventilation. Here are some of the accommodation units. You can see that the balconies have different sizes. The taller walls are supposed to act as places of retreat when you want to pray, and the others are for more normal type of usage. You can see an elevation from, and here also you can see the stair and remdurf and bricks that we're using as vocabulary. It was important for us to create a lot of green space in between, because they do really create a microclimate, and in places like ours it's quite important. This is a view of the main room connecting all the others, which is basically a shed just to provide shade and create cross ventilation. And this is an image of the chapel just on the body of water and looking out towards the forest. The next project is one that we got an award for at the World Architecture Festival, which is a gymnasium in Abidjan. It's the French school's gymnasium. And what's really particular about this building is we try to think of it as something that is originates at least from our climate. And of course, from the program, we had to deal with different elements. And what we chose to do is to put like all the hard stuff on the ground. The place where we don't need as much span. On top of that, on top of that, we have concrete structure, metallic structure, big overhangs to house the big room, and this is like a hat that sort of protects the building from the elements. Here you can see a section of the building and how it actually works. We have a 6-meter overhang on the periphery of the building just to avoid the elements to get in, specifically the rain, the sun. And also, we do allow for the wind to go across. In this concrete structure below, we have openings above so the wind can freely go in. And on the structure that is on top, we are using perforated metal sheeting to have total transparency on the site around. So this gives you an interesting quality of space. When you walk in, you can actually see the surrounding and not realize that actually you do have this overhang and you do have this big hat that protects the building from the elements. Inside, the spaces are pretty raw, really, pebble on the ground and still perforated sheeting to avoid the balls to throw out of, to come out of the spaces. And the rest is relatively bare. The metal structure is exposed, the drains as well, because we had to make it relatively cheap. And this is an image from the outside, where from the outside you can actually read the red hat, but from the inside it totally disappears because of the perforation effect. After that, I'm going to talk about this building. This is pretty urban, and this is sort of stuff that we're, as architects, working in an urban environment, confronted to. And this was a building, complex building, that had to house one apartment building in the back and an office building in the front. There we try to use a very simple and very basic move in order to protect the facade from the sun. And as you can see, here the windows are very basic. I mean, they're just sliding windows on a 1 meter wall parapet. but we're using those panels to sort of regulate the amount of sun that goes in. For the office building as well, and certain facades have been planted with those planters, and that totally filters the sun when we have direct exposure. Also, we like to bring in a lot of greenery. When it grows, it creates like natural shaded and natural microclimate in the environment. Here you can see the apartment building where the balconies have been staggered to allow certain plants to grow taller, as opposed to just be on that level. And when it grows, I mean, this is a picture that was taken 2 years after it was delivered, and you can really see how the vegetation is recolonizing the building. And we like to think that our buildings should disappear behind greenery after a while, you know, when we let it happen. So this is for pretty much the physical context, and now I'm going to go into the part I call social engineering, which for me is really about design. And what I've discovered and what we've discovered with design is that it really allows you, or trains you a certain thinking that allows you to go beyond the building. And I'm going to talk about this with a few examples of social engineering. So we're back in this coastal town called Assini, and right here is my house, a house I built a few years ago. And what was really striking to me living in Abidjan is the way things develop and how they develop fast, and how land can be sold to many people and not necessarily have a coherent vision about the environment. So being here, I became very worried about what was going to happen here. And going there quite often, I pretty much identified who was the owner of this land in the back, and approached him and told him, well, I don't have the resources to buy all your land, but what I can do is sell your land for you. So I could identify who would buy this land and then sort of rework on the land, and this is how we could achieve to have like a big garden here, and we redesigned the layout, and we sold to people we knew, and mainly friends, with with certain guidelines. We told them, well, first thing, this is how it's going to happen. The fence is all going to be bamboo, and well, you're going to have to pay for the urbanism. I mean, you're going to have to plant big trees. I mean, we can negotiate to have like lighting, from the municipality, and we're offering you a certain model of house as a plan that you can adapt according to your use. And this is actually how we pretty easily sold all the plots, and with also renderings to sort of make it attractive. And glad that after a few years now, I mean, this is something we started about 6 years ago, we're finally completed out of almost 20-something houses, we finally completed 4. This is, of course, when you're doing architecture in that type of environment, it's probably going to be a secondary home. So it has to be relatively inexpensive. And as you can see here, this is typology that was developed to be very easy to build. Only the columns are concrete, and the rest is wooden roof with local material to cover the structure. And all the rooms are cross-ventilated, so you don't have hallways or places that are completely shut off from the terrace. And you have 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom living space with a kitchen inside. And of course the pool being a key element in that type of environment. The bathrooms are very basic, no doors, pretty much open. The floors are cement floors, nothing fancy. And the idea of those places is they have to be pretty flexible and invite to a different type of living. And social engineering has to go further, and of course, learning from that environment that we pretty much use as our laboratory, we were able to sort of maybe think a little bigger. And this is our first big, I would say, social engineering project, which is Résidence Chocolat. We, at some point, realized that we had to think differently about the way we live in cities. And in order to create new typologies, instead of waiting for a client to come, we decided to become developers. And that has really changed the game in our practice, because suddenly we could experiment on some of our projects, new typologies and new ways of living, which people would be reluctant to subscribe to initially. So this place was initially designed in a neighborhood of Abidjan where you usually have like one house on 2,000 square meters. And of course, with the way our cities are developing, we cannot sustain that model. And we decided to pretty much densify in the same area, staying pretty much in the same kind of, actually dealing with the same kind of clients, people who usually have big houses. The main idea here is to take all the cars down to an underground parking space and create public space above that people can use and engage in while being linked to the parking space from their habitat. You know, one typology is a house and the other is an apartment building. Of course, we thought that it was interesting to do that, you know, from a sustainability point of view, but also from a it became sort of a pretext to also reshape the way people live. People who usually live on one plot are not used to dealing with 32 units altogether. And this is actually what made them interested in this project, because all of a sudden they were not alone on their plot and they could share a certain number of amenities, including like the gardening, including like the repainting of the house every 5 years, including a generator that they share as a community, really. This is what it has become now, a community. And they realize also that when you sort of divide all of this by 32, it's a lot cheaper than actually being on a big plot with your own house. And here you can see how dense it is compared to the other plots in the neighborhood. And it's funny, ever since we finished this project, which was about 4 or 5 years ago, a lot of other plots have densified in the neighborhood. That's an image of the public space we've created, a view of one of the apartment buildings. And here as well, it was important for us to use a lot of green to create shades and also to create a different type of atmosphere. That's a view of one of the houses. That's the entry to the apartment building. All of the circulation are naturally ventilated, including the parking spaces, which are also naturally ventilated and planted as well. That's a view of one of the apartments. Bathroom. And having been quite successful with this first project, we thought it was actually important to move to a different scale, because 32 units in a city like Abidjan is just like a drop in the water. And we thought, now having gained sort of experience from this first project, we could move on to something bigger. And we just broke ground on this project that is 226 units, which is pretty much in a village, not too far from Abidjan, about 20 minutes from the center of Abidjan. And of course, when you're dealing with 226 units, you can do much more in terms of what you can provide to the neighborhood. So a sports venue, for instance, an office building. We also have like a promenade on the lagoon that benefits all the residents. And also have created sort of semi-private spaces for the habitants to have different layers of privacy in terms of the way they live and in terms of the way they want to engage in community. Here you can see some of the retail spaces, and the ambition is to create sort of an interesting microcosm. Of course, we would like to, I mean, we're aiming to include a lot of diversity. I mean, not only in the typologies of building, but also dealing with small apartments allows us to bring in different types of population, you know, from younger people to people who are definitely more established to people who are retired. And of course, the idea is that such an environment becomes a solution to their living status. Similar type of parking space. And this just broke ground and is actually is currently under construction, which leads me to another project which we think of as our retirement project. This is a village not too far from Abidjan, in the network of the lagoon that joins some number of villages and cities in Côte d'Ivoire. And what we're trying to do here is start from a village, an existing village that is on the water. And because of the position of this village and the network of roads that is growing fast, we fear that if it's not really taken care of, it may become like some of the neighborhoods we have in the city that are not really controlled and are just evolving to, you know, as the roads actually go. And we tend to think that the roads tend to bring chaos. And in this environment, what we're trying to do is sort of create a sound environment out of all of this. And first thing we did was to do a schematic plan and sort of give the ingredients of what we think should be the ideal habitat in our cities. Starting with the idea that we should be able to pretty much do 80% of our activities just by foot or by bike. We should pretty much be able to somehow create our own energy, to also create our own agriculture, at least on the scale of this, and also our own administration. Which I personally think is usually the problem in a lot of African cities, is the fact that they spread and the administration is pretty much immaterial, whereas when you go to villages, everybody knows the chief. So the tools of power are much easier to implement. When you come to a city, nobody knows their mayor. So this is something that is really dear to us, and of course it takes a long time. We're still at the very early stages. We've finally had the agreement of the landowners, meaning the villagers, to sort of subscribe to the project, but now we have to go through a certain number of stages before it becomes something real, and this is why we think that it's going to be a project that's going to last for at least 15, 20 years. So I used to be very critical of working with African states in general. I still am, and I think it really depends on the countries, but we recently had the opportunity to work with the state of Benin on multiple projects, including one that I think is really major. It is 20,000 units of low-income habitat that we had to develop, and of course, initially, when we look at it and when somebody comes to you with such a project, they usually think of it in terms of habitat and not necessarily in terms of urban planning. And for us, it was pretty much an opportunity to sort of go beyond what we usually do, which is, working on one or few units, and really start thinking about how do we sort of recreate, or how do we create a sound urban environment for African cities. And what we quickly found out is that designing is actually maybe a very, very small part of what we had to do, designing the units. And it's pretty much designing the systems that will make the environment work. So we had to deal with mobility, for instance. We had to deal with the amount of green. We had to deal with parking. We had to deal with what do we do with all the moto taxis that we have in Cotonou. We had to create like lanes specific to motorbikes. We had to think about how do they evolve in the future. Will they become at some point electric? How do we recharge them? I mean, all of those were issues very dear to us when we designed this thing. And actually, the buildings are very basic, but efficient, all cross-ventilated, so we don't accumulate heat. And the urbanism on the other end is where all the energy went. How do we design specific sewage for our African cities, with low maintenance? How do we incorporate that sewage to public space? How do we create public spaces that is very much in line with what we find in our cities? And how do we learn from the things that we see in our cities to create, or at least foster, a certain way of living in our cities? One thing that was really important to us and that we realized is that the presence of retail in African cities is really, really important. And this is something that we had to sort of go back to the drawing board and re-incorporate. This is a project that broke ground. I mean, we've built about 20 units so far. It's also very interesting to see how it goes and how it evolves. It's really important to have a government that has a vision, and in this case, we do have at least an administration that understands what low-income housing is. The principle of the units is that they're relatively affordable, but only one unit is allowed to be bought by one person. So you cannot buy 10 units. Also, it's you just pay monthly rent, and after 17 years, you can become the owner. And one thing that was also very important in such a project is the administration. How do you make sure that after you leave, the place still is maintained? How do people pay for their fees every month? And of course, we found ways, and this is what is really interesting when you're working at the level of the state. We found ways to have that sort of be on their electrical bill, so they don't have to necessarily pay it. It's directly paid, from the bill. And you can see here images of what the environment looks like. And now I would like to just talk a little bit about the future. Of course, I recently realized that I'm not the future anymore. And that it was very much important for me to sort of find out what was in the head of younger architects and what they imagined architecture should be. And they quickly told me it's not about architecture, it's about urbanism. And it's about what we do with our cities, it's about how we deploy them, it's about scale, it's about governance, it's about sustainability, and we have to totally rethink the whole process. They tend to think that whatever we're doing right now is, of course, doomed from the beginning because we do not have the right philosophical ingredients to start with. So working with them was really a blessing, because they came up with this little film to pretty much illustrate what they think urbanism and architecture should be. Thank you very much.